So everyone has seen the news article of like something reduces the risk of something else by 80%. And then everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. What you are all hearing is something referred to as the relative risk, as opposed to the absolute risk. I think this is the thing where, especially a lot of the wellness industries, people are getting paid big bucks to do things that grab your attention. And 9 times out of 10, if you see something that amazing, it's a relative risk. What do you think?
You're totally right. A lot of stuff. And I mean, a lot of journals do that. A lot of media, traditional media does that. Pharmaceutical companies do that. So the wellness industry does it as well, but they're not unique in that. Like you said, marketing
No.
is marketing. And when you think about that relative risk, you need to think about that in terms of what your baseline risk is. So when we talk about things, mortality is something that we talk about a lot about in emergency medicine. And we see things that have really high mortality, a lot of emergencies. So if you go from 40% to 20%, that's a lot of lives you saved. You get a 40% chance of dying, and I drop that down to 20%. That's a lot of lives saved. The relative risk of that is going to be 50% because you went from 40 to 20. But your overall risk, because your risk was so high, that 50% is a huge benefit. Whereas if your baseline risk of getting something is 0.1%, and you drop that by 50%, you only dropped it to 0.05%, but those are both 50% reductions. Dropping your mortality from 40% to 20% is a really big deal. Dropping your risk 0.1% to 0.05% is not as impressive.
Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype, dig into what's real, what works, and what's backed by evidence. I'm your host, Dr. AK. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are covering part 2 of how to spot pseudoscience. So if you listened to last week, you met Dr. Josh Davis. He is here again. We are continuing the conversation. So Josh, I'm going to let you chime in and just give everyone a little reminder about who you are.
Sure. So I'm Josh Davis. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I'm assistant medical director for research and education here in our practice at Vituity in Wichita, Kansas. Also, professor of clinical medicine at Kansas College of Osteopathic Medicine and the University of Kansas here in Wichita, where I teach a lot of the topics that we're talking about evidence-based medicine and how to apply it to clinical practice to some of our medical students. And I also was one of your residents quite long ago. So I actually learned all of this from you.
You learned some of it from me. You've done, as a resident, when you graduated, you had more publications than I did as you're attending. So I'm giving you full credit for that. All right. So last week, I brought up the fact that one of the reasons I was inspired to even do this topic in the first place was because I went to this event and someone was there, made some pretty strong health claims about a patch. It was a patch that you put somewhere on your body, and it used salt and sugar crystals to use light waves to change your peptides in your DNA. And obviously, I want to get into the nitty-gritty of different studies because the woman that was talking to me said, there's a ton of studies and evidence to support that. But before we break that down, because we know how I am, and people are listening to me all the time, and I feel like they're like, oh God, she's such a non-believer in everything. What about that claim, before we even get into the research, doesn't sit well with you? Well, let me back up a little bit. A lot of us who have gone to medical school or have done any kind of formal training in science, we are very all about the post-positivism in terms of the data, right? Like we want data. That's because of how we were trained through medicine. Oftentimes we want to see the numbers, and we were taught if there's not numbers, we can't support it. That's not necessarily true in terms of reality. And Josh, you mentioned this last week. You talked about how when it comes to a lot of these more natural, less manipulated compounds, right? Like certain supplements and certain things like that. In medicine, we tend to kind of turn our back on that. In Western medicine, right? I think Eastern medicine is a lot more embracing of that. And so what I don't want to happen here is I don't want to conflate that aspect of people not wanting to believe in the quote natural medicine versus what is happening with the health claims that were made in this patch. So before we get into that, I just wanted to address that. This isn't like, oh, it's something that is not traditional medicine, so it can't be true. No, there are several other red flags with this claim. And so I'm going to let you get into that, Josh, before we get into the weeds of all the different studies.
My eyes went a little bug-eyed when you made that claim kind of last time about that kind of patch and stuff. So some of the things that I hear in that already are red flags for me are things like cures everything, right? You can't tell me actually what it does and how it works. It just cures everything. You kind of have to have a fundamental, going back to what I was saying, you have to have a fundamental reason or biological plausibility as to why something might work. And I think you and I both know that sugar, salt to light beams to peptides to DNA is not any recognized biomedical pathway. That doesn't work that way. And so that is another red flag in addition to this like claim all thing that it fixes everything, right? Does it work on inflammation? Does it work on diet? How does it work is one of the fundamentals for the basics. You have to have a biological reason why something works before you can even get into other science and things like that. Now, sometimes we go backwards. Sometimes we get patient evident data and then we go back and figure out the science of how it works. And then I think the last thing there is when someone, you had mentioned kind of last time, when someone says that there's lots of research and then the research is a patient testimonial. I think the example I like to use is when we were in COVID times, right? When my mom got COVID, she put syrup on her pancakes in the morning and then she got better from her COVID. Well, she was going to get better from her COVID anyway. I could say, oh, well, my mom got syrup and she got better from her COVID. And so everyone should do syrup because that fixes COVID when really they're totally two unrelated things. But that individual patient could come up with that claim. And that's kind of those limitations of using testimonials. Not to say they're not evidence, they're just not great quality evidence.
We're going to get into that. We are going to talk about the hierarchy of evidence. So when it comes to the health and wellness sphere, a lot of people are like, there's research. But then when you look at the research, you realize, yeah, there's something out there. But when it comes to the hierarchy of evidence, that's not really at the top of the chain. What the hierarchy of evidence is, there are a series of different kinds of research studies that can be done. And each one of those is done for a different reason. And the evidence that they provide, it's kind of like a pyramid that goes up. And if any of you are on the blog, I created this graphic that's on there. Truth, my 12-year-old created it on Canva under my direction because I really struggled to make it. But he did it. But there's a graphic on there that shows how reliable that evidence is in terms of what it's trying to communicate. So I want to kind of get into that a little bit. I talked about the patient testimonials. Now, nowhere is a patient testimonial considered evidence, but some people will try and claim that they are kind of at that bottom of the pyramid where I have case studies. So why don't you share your thoughts and insights on case studies and what it is they actually tell us?
So a case study has a lot of the limitations of kind of a testimonial. The problem with the testimonial is you don't have a lot of the other data that goes into a case study that helps us analyze it. So a case study is a several page-long report that looks at biological plausibility, other case studies on the subject, other reasons why this might happen, and we get all of the patient's vital signs and exam and lab values and how they responded and what other things were given to them and all of those other things and what the time course was. So a case study is actually like a detailed peer-reviewed report of things. And sometimes they're novel treatments, sometimes they're novel disease processes. Sometimes we use them for kind of diagnosis or kind of treatment. Whereas a testimonial is, in my mind, when I hear testimonial, I think of like one or two sentences of like, I love this thing, or, this thing was great. And I don't have a lot of that other information that helps me analyze the quality of it, right? The case study is the bottom of the rung. It's already a pretty low bar of evidence. But then when you get into a testimonial, I don't even have that. I just have someone said something good, and I don't really know a lot what to do with that.
Yeah, honestly, even case studies, I think case studies are cool in like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's a thing. But it really is just a more scientific way of saying, I know this guy who did this, and this is what he said. They're really interesting to read. I think they're really, really good in terms of giving people some food for thought. They probably stimulate a lot of ideas in terms of future research projects, but in them of themselves, I would not consider that evidence. It's a nice story.
I think across general populations, you're probably true. I think there are some value in super rare things, like you have a
True.
super rare kind of cancer that doesn't have any treatment, and we tried this treatment and the patient got better. So then the next person in 10 years who's the only person who's ever had that treatment, I guess we'll try this treatment, because we're never going to get any data better than that, because one person every 10 years has this kind of cancer.
That's a really good point. I like that a lot. The next form of research that I have on the tier are the observational and retrospective studies. And this is the area where I'm always getting into arguments with people that correlation is not causation, right? So these observational and retrospective studies, they're really great at identifying possible patterns or relationships, and that's it. What do you think?
So the one other thing I want to highlight before we move on to observational is there's also at the bottom rung there's that expert opinion is the other
I
thing.
didn't even count that.
But that's a lot.
But
So if
no,
you
but
look at a
no,
lot of stuff,
we should. Go
yeah,
ahead.
a lot of stuff you look in at that we do, and you and I know this because we've debated this many times. A
Yeah.
lot of stuff we do is expert opinion based. We've always done it that way, so we should keep doing it that way. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, that is a level of evidence. It's just, again, not a very good one. We don't have any science to support it. And there's lots of things we do in medicine and lots of things we've done for many years that someone goes back and realizes we're still doing based on expert opinion. And then they do a good study and they find out that it doesn't work. And so I think that that's also another thing, is to look and say, and expert being expert, like multiple national expert guidelines, not Jane Fonda on Twitter, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, no, expert opinion, it's usually, professional societal recommendations and guidelines that are put out there, and they give you that whole like different classes of evidence to support whatever it is that they're saying. So, no, you are correct. I shouldn't completely poo-poo expert opinion. Look at this. The student becomes the teacher.
Well, and I think it's important, though, like you said, they're national guidelines. They're not just because someone is a doctor or has a PhD that they are an expert, and what they say is an expert opinion. That's not totally the same thing. And that goes for you and me, too. The two of us sitting here, what we're saying is not expert opinion. It doesn't qualify to that level. Just because someone has a doctor or has an MD doesn't make them an expert in whatever they're talking about.
That is true. That expertise is typically sought out by looking at publications, what their track record is on those publications, and what their contributions have been on that topic throughout their career. So these are really good points to raise. Now, talk to me about the observational and retrospectives. This is, I think, where we get hung up a lot. I went and I got boarded in lifestyle medicine. And so I have this practice, and a lot of my medical practice focuses on making nutrition recommendations. And one of the really hard things about nutrition recommendations is a lot of them come from observational studies. So there is a lot of correlation, but not necessarily causation. So share your thoughts on that.
No, that's totally true. And I mean, you give the example of drownings in ice cream in the summer. It's hot, and so people take ice cream. It's hot, so people get in the pools. But actually, ice cream and drownings have no actual relationship themselves. It's this third variable. The other one that we talk about a lot is smoking, or coffee and cancer. People who smoke also drink coffee, and so that's why coffee has this high kind of cancer risk. It's not the coffee itself. So very, very common. And nutrition's tough because you really, like, that sometimes is the highest level you're going to get. It's very difficult from a practical standpoint to totally isolate someone's nutrition, because basically you'd have to isolate them in a hospital unit or a research unit, and you control everything that they eat and drink. And all of us are different with our nutritional needs and things like that. And so giving everyone the exact same nutrition, there's a lot of other variables at play. And so it's really difficult. I mean, I think that ties into things. Sometimes when we look at these correlational studies, we have to acknowledge the limitations, but also acknowledge that sometimes that's the highest level we're going to get. So for example, smoking, I'm never going to be able to randomize giving someone a cigarette and not giving them a cigarette, right? But we do know from many, many, many observational studies that less cigarettes are associated with less cancer and less, lung disease and things like that. So we have to accept that data. But there is, after you have many, many, many studies, there is a way to use correlational data to establish a causation. It just takes a whole set of criteria. I think most of us accept that smoking causes cancer, right? Like we have accepted that, but that's because there's been hundreds of studies on it and in different methods. And there's a whole bunch of criteria that you have to go through in order to kind of get to that level. And a lot of the stuff in the natural field, particularly nutrition, it's very, very difficult to get isolated things. And so you have to accept that, and you have to look at the whole body of evidence and not conflate the fact about correlation and retrospective and observational studies being causation. No matter how much control they say they put in there, there's always the opportunity for that.
Exactly. And so that's one of the things that I often stress with my patients. One of the examples I use all the time is saturated fats. I'm like, I cannot tell you with 100% certainty that saturated fats cause atherosclerosis. I can tell you with about 99% certainty that it does, based on the large body of evidence that we have. They're observational studies. They've gone through reanalysis with Mendelian randomization, which we don't even need to get into. But once you have a whole bunch of observational studies, you can then use other techniques to try and establish something beyond correlation. So I think one of the key things to take away is when we are talking about observational or retrospective studies that have correlation, what is the total body of literature? So if you look at one study and it's just that one study and everything else out there counters what that one study is saying, I don't think it is because that one study is correct and all the other ones are wrong. And I think that's what happens a lot is people will see this one outlying piece of data that supports what they really, really want it to support. And then they really lean heavily into that. And then that's kind of one of those, quote, fatal flaws, if you will, of research.
Well, I think one thing I really like about you, and I've always liked about you, but I think I want to highlight here is what the way that you frame that, right? You actually take the integrity approach of saying, no, I'm not 100% certain in this. And that is a sign to me of somebody who actually understands and appreciates how science works. If you hear people making absolutist claims about this works all the time, this works for everything, those are people that you really should be questioning their ability to understand that literature. Even you, who understands all of these data and studies and things, still is not 100% certain in anything. And I think people who are well grounded in science will always have a but if kind of approach to their understanding, because even when we get to these higher levels of evidence, we're going to talk about issues that could go along with them. And so I think that that's a really important thing to highlight here is your ability to do that is what makes you so respectable in the field. And then the other thing you highlight is I found this one study. There's so many studies now, which we talked about in our last podcast. Like eventually you can find at least one study to support almost any view you want to have of anything in the world. I mean, so I think it's important to recognize, like you said, the body of the literature. And this is where we might take a little offshoot to talk about how the statistics in medicine work. The number that we traditionally use in medicine is 95% sure. So we use a p-value, and a p-value is the risk that something is not true. And so we traditionally in medicine will use a p-value of 0.05, which means I'm 95% sure that this is true. So that means if I do 100 studies, there will be 5 studies out there that say it's not true and 95 that says it is. And that's what you should really be trusting, are those 95 that are, and not the one study that you found that's kind of off. It's kind of like Vegas, right? Like you should know by looking that the house always wins, right? Like 95% of the time the house wins. That's how they got all those big hotels and the multi-millions. But one person will win every once in a while. And that doesn't mean that you should trust that every time you pull that slot machine, you're going to win, right? You should trust that 95% of the time you're not going to win.
Analogy. I love that analogy. That's awesome. All right. So when we talk about this next higher level of evidence, we are talking about kind of the gold standard for cause and effect, which are those randomized controlled trials. So talk to me about that, because I feel like your insights on this are going to be really valuable.
These are really the studies that I look for practice changing. If I'm going to change something that I'm currently doing, these are really the kind of level of evidence and above where I'm looking to do so. And I think randomized control traditionally came up over a century ago. What we're going to do is we're going to give someone a placebo or an inert substance, and nobody else is going to know what they're getting, so that we can see how this drug or treatment works compared to nothing, when we have to acknowledge that sometimes people get better over time regardless. So I think a great example of that is antibiotics for viral illnesses, right? Most people are going to get better from their viral illness in 5 to 6 days. And so if I give people antibiotics and they get better, and we're looking at it from a correlation standpoint, people say, I got antibiotics, so I got better. Whereas when we actually do a good randomized trial, we know that those people get better anyway. The people who got the antibiotics and the people who don't get the antibiotics, both of them get better. right? So I think that that's a really good example of that. And this is really the one that I look for. And there's a couple things that you highlighted in your blog post that I think are important acknowledgments, which just because it's randomized and controlled doesn't mean that it is the best evidence, but it is better. But we have to acknowledge how many patients they did it on, where it was located. Does this patient represent me? So the Women's Health Initiative is a really good example. That was a randomized trial, but all of those people were given late hormone therapy. And so the increased risk was given 10 years after menopause started. And it took decades for people to recognize that doesn't represent the people that we're recommending hormone therapy to, even though it was applied to them. They took these people who
Yeah.
got late hormone therapy and they applied it to 50-year-old women who had severe menopausal symptoms, and the risks there aren't the same, and the benefits aren't the same.
Very good, tying in a passion topic of mine. No, it's true. So, RCTs are really hard to do. A really good randomized control trial will have huge numbers of the target population you're trying to test something into. It's going to be double blinded. Like you said, neither the researchers nor the participants are going to know what they're getting. It's going to be a control. You have that one arm who they're getting the placebo because you need something to compare it to. What would you do if you did nothing, or standard of care? Oftentimes, the control group is standard of care if you're trying to introduce a new treatment. So you have to see what those differences are. But here's the thing. They are hella expensive because of that. So the more people that you have, the more researchers you're paying for, the more lab data and other analytics you're obtaining. They're really, really expensive studies. And so the reason I want to bring this up is there are a lot of people who are not feeling big pharma. I'm in that category. I don't love big pharma. I think pharmaceutical companies ethically have some major issues, but they're the ones who can fund those studies. And we'll get into this a little bit more. We're going to talk about funding sources and things like that when you're looking at the different studies. But I just want everyone to know that randomized control trials are super expensive. And if the money's not coming from the NIH, it's not going to come from many other sources. There aren't a bunch of billionaires who are just investing all of their dollars into randomized control trials. And so a lot of that money is coming from big pharma. So it's just worth mentioning how expensive they are. All right. The final one that I mentioned in the blog are the systematic review and meta-analyses. And so these are the studies of the studies. There are very strict criteria that researchers have to follow. We have the Prisma and some of these other criteria that are out there. So talk to me a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of these, because, they are good. I often refer to them as almost like a cheat sheet of someone else who looked at the whole body of literature and then gave me this information to deduce. But there's also some things about them that aren't so great.
Yeah. So this is kind of my areas of expertise. I've done a large amount of them. And I think you're right. A well-done systematic review and meta-analysis is an excellent addition to the literature. That's what a lot of National Society guidelines have moved to make their guidelines, is to do a well-done systematic review and meta-analysis. You mentioned Prisma. GRADE is another thing that we utilize in that process to make those guidelines. But I think you have to recognize that these are what I like to call garbage in, garbage out. So if you take a bunch of bad studies and put them in and don't analyze them well, even if you do analyze them well, you're going to get not good data out, even though it's a number. And we like that number that it comes out with, right? But if you look at some of these studies, they're so different, or they're not studying the same population, that number really doesn't mean anything, even though you can get a number. And that's one of the flaws we see in meta-analyses, is people like to take a bunch of studies and get a number out. And as humans, we really like that number at the end. Oh, this is how much it works or how much it doesn't work. But if you go back and look at either the analysis, if you don't do the analysis well, but also if you just are not putting in really great studies, you can end up with kind of garbage data, even though it's a number and it looks good and it comes from a
It's
meta-analysis.
pretty garbage.
Yeah, that's really important. But a well-done meta-analysis is great. So if you have a meta-analysis of randomized trials, that really is your kind of highest level of evidence. But I think we need to acknowledge that if you're doing a meta-analysis of case studies or a systematic review of case studies, that really is not a super high level of evidence. Even though it looks like it's at the top and it has the word systematic review in it, that is not actually at the top level of evidence above what would have been a randomized controlled trial. And sometimes it's a large, well-done randomized controlled trial with multiple patients in multiple like institutions and sites across the country or across the world is better than a bunch of little randomized trials put into a meta-analysis. So
Yeah.
there's limitations there. They kind of go back and forth depending on the quality.
Yeah, I like the systematic review meta-analyses for those types of studies where you can't get huge numbers for a randomized control trial. I really do like them, but just like you pointed out, there are some flaws. Any last thoughts on the hierarchy of evidence? Because I want to move into another topic. All right, so everyone has seen the news article. Something reduces the risk of something else by 80%. And then everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. What you are all hearing is something referred to as the relative risk, as opposed to the absolute risk. I think this is the thing where, especially a lot of the wellness industries, people are getting paid big bucks to do things that grab your attention. And 9 times out of 10, if you see something that amazing, it's a relative risk. What do you think?
You're totally right. A lot of journals do that. A lot of media, traditional media does that. Pharmaceutical companies do that. So the wellness industry does it as well, but they're not unique in that. Marketing
No.
is marketing. And so when you think about that relative risk, you need to think about that in terms of what your baseline risk is. So when we talk about things, we see a lot of things. Mortality is something that we talk about a lot about in emergency medicine, and we see things that have really high mortality, a lot of emergencies. So if you go from 40% to 20%, that's a lot of lives you saved, right? If your mortality when you walked into the hospital, you had a 40% chance of dying, and I dropped that down to 20%, that's a lot of lives saved. The relative risk of that is going to be 50%. Because you went from 40 to 20, but your overall risk, because your risk was so high, that 50% is a huge benefit. Whereas if your baseline risk of getting something is 0.1%, and you drop that by 50%, you only dropped it to 0.05%. Those are both 50% reductions, but dropping your mortality from 40% to 20% is a really big deal. Dropping from 0.1% to 0.05% is not as impressive. And so when you think about the risks of whatever intervention you're talking about, the pill or the surgery or whatever other thing, taking something out of your diet, putting something into your diet, those things, you really need to consider how much benefit you're going to get.
Yeah. I'm going to rewind for 1 second. I should have said this earlier. So relative risk is the change in percentage. Absolute risk is the actual change in number. And so another example, just to highlight, is let's say we have a group and the risk of something before the intervention was 2 out of 1,000. And then we do the intervention and it goes to 1 out of 1,000, right? The relative risk is a 50% reduction. The absolute risk was a 0.1% reduction. When we're addressing relative risk versus absolute risk, the absolute risk tells a much more accurate story of what's actually happening as opposed to the relative risk, which is comparing the percentages. There's also p-hacking. Now, you mentioned a p-value earlier, and so p-values, just as Josh mentioned, that's what we use to kind of assign whether something happened based on chance or whether it's from whatever it is that we're studying. And like he said, we like to be 95% sure, at least. We want to be at least 95% sure that this is something based on what we're studying and not from chance. So how does p-hacking take advantage of that?
Yeah, so basically what p-hacking is you take a set of data and for example, you analyze 100 different questions on the same set of data. So I'm going to look at age and gender and what phase of the moon it is and whether you're left-handed or right-handed, and I'm going to pick 100 different variables. If I do that 100 times and all of them are by chance, if I'm using a p-value of 0.05, 5 of them are going to come up as significant. And there are studies looking at things literally like how treatments work based on the phase of the moon that kind of demonstrate this as an example of if you look at enough variables, you will find something that comes across as statistically significant, but it's only because we analyzed it 100 times. And sometimes, not ethical, but sometimes researchers don't actually mention all of the 100 things they looked at in order to arrive at that one conclusion. Like you had mentioned earlier in our last podcast, sometimes they split them up into different studies, even though it was one big analysis and they found one thing that was kind of statistically significant.
Yeah, a really good study is going to, in the very beginning, share the primary outcome, the secondary, the tertiary outcomes. So, primary outcomes are basically this is the main reason why I'm doing the study. Secondary and tertiary are the oh, by the way. Primary is this is really why I want to do it. Secondary and tertiary is like, well, we're doing it. We're here. We're getting the data. So we're going to go ahead and look at these two other things as well. If you read the primary outcome of a study and then you read the conclusion and the discussion, and 99% of the conclusion and discussion have absolutely nothing to do with the primary outcome, there was probably some p hacking that went on in that study. And that is a red flag. So when you see these huge, like 50, 80, 90% reduction, take a look. Is it relative risk? Is it absolute risk? And if the conclusion has a little sniff of the primary outcome, there's probably some p hacking. So I think those are two things that people have to be aware of. Any other thoughts on those topics?
I would just add for your listeners too, like those people who really want to get into understanding this and stuff, is actually a lot of trials are registered, and you can actually look at
Oh, yeah.
what outcome. So clinicaltrials.gov is one place, but there's a couple other places that you can register your trials, and you can actually go look at what they plan to do, like what they applied their grant for and what they said they were going to do, and then what they published their paper on, which is not always the same thing. And so that's also a red flag that, well, we didn't find what we wanted to, so we changed the outcome halfway through.
Well, I mean, publications are currency in academics. The other thing that you want to look for anytime you are looking at a study are conflicts of interest. So every legitimate journal, and Josh, you and I just published a paper together. And in that paper, when we submitted it, we had to declare what our conflicts of interest are. You are legally bound to do that. And you are also bound to report funding. So if you read a paper and if people have declared none and they have no funding and they say it, okay. But if you don't see that written anywhere, that's another red flag that this paper is very questionable because that hasn't been reported.
Very much so. I mean, I think you and I do our best to stay away from kind of the conflicts so that we can be objective researchers. But at some point, if you want to be a big researcher, you have to take money from someone to do your studies. And that money doesn't often go always to the researchers. But I think you highlight two things. One is which we self-claim our own conflicts of interest and are put on our own ability to do that. We do that at our institutions in addition to when we publish things. But that's relying on self-reporting, which obviously has errors and biases. I think you and I both would err very far on the side of over-disclosing things, just so that we don't end up with someone coming back later and saying, but actually you did have this conflict of interest that you didn't declare, even if it's just perceived, right? Like anything that's perceived. Because we know in medicine that even when the pharmaceutical rep comes and gives you a pen in the office, like that influences your prescribing practices. We know that that's really true. I mean, so that happens in research too. And so even things that you don't think are affecting you really could be. And I will point out the one thing that I think probably most of your readers are aware of, which is the Sunshine Act, where you can look and see, at least physicians, you can look and see where they've gotten at least direct funding from. It's not all possible conflicts of interest, but you can see where people have gotten funding from, so you can have an idea of whether they're being truthful about their conflicts of interest. And that's
Yeah,
free
I've
access.
actually
Anyone can look it up. It was put into law a couple of years ago.
I actually talked about that. I did a blog on vaccines. And because, a lot of people will make claims that doctors are making a ton of money off of vaccines. And honestly, in my heart of hearts, I'm like, that's not true. But I decided to go look. You can look and see if doctors are actually making money from pharmaceutical companies. And lo and behold, on the Sunshine Act, they have to report it. I mean, not only do they have to report it, but the pharmaceutical company has to report it. It's reported from both ends. And so you can actually put in the name of a physician and see how much money they got from a pharmaceutical company. So I think that's definitely worth looking into. And I think if ever you hear these claims that are made about, physicians are in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies, if you have a question about a certain physician, you can look into it. I will tell you, I think I'm on there. In 2007, I got lunch from something in residency. And so I think I got $11.75 or something like that from a pharmaceutical company.
I think
And
I have a couple of
FYI,
those too. Yeah.
yeah, but not from residency, because when I was your associate program director, I would not let any pharmaceutical companies come in to talk to you guys. Just I don't know if you picked up on that or not, but all right. And then the other thing we talked about is funding. And so I do think we just have to acknowledge that some of these studies are really expensive. And so they are going to have funding from these different pharmaceutical companies, and take that for what it's worth. If it's a paper that was funded by a pharmaceutical company, but the science in it is sound, then yeah, you can approach it with a little bit of skepticism, but at the same time, it probably is sound. There have been certain studies that have come out that have been funded by pharmaceutical companies where if you really look at the data, you're like, is it really that much of a difference? I like to highlight Tamiflu, but we won't get into that. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes the science is there and obviously there's a clear benefit and sometimes there isn't. And I think you just have to understand that the money has to come from somewhere.
Well, and one thing that you can look for in the journals is reporting of how the funder was involved in the study. I have worked with clinical trials of people and pharmaceutical companies, and many times they are not involved at all. You send them the data, they oversee it and make sure it's accurate, but they don't have any say-so in the running of the study or what the data shows or how to analyze it or whether to publish it or not. Those are things where the bias can come in. I'm a pharmaceutical company, I do a big study and it shows something doesn't work. I might choose not to publish that. Whereas if I am just funding you to do a study and you get the data, then it's your choice whether you publish it or not. Then I don't have any say-so over that. And that can help limit the bias. It doesn't get rid of it, right? Because I choose who gets the money. I choose the outcomes I think are going to look good. And that's what goes into pharmaceutical funding, those. They pick the outcomes they think are going to look good, not necessarily the ones that are the best for science. And they choose who they're going to fund because they want people who are in support of whatever their kind of drug and stuff is. But really good studies will report how the funders played a role in whether they developed it, whether they analyzed it, whether they had any say-so. And what you want to see is no involvement at all. Again, that doesn't obviate all of the bias of having pharmaceutical funding, but that can help mitigate it.
Exactly. So we are pretty much at time. So I want to wrap things up here. Between last week's podcast and what we're covering this week, the key take-home points are whenever you are hearing some kind of health claim or hearing, oh, this great thing about some new wellness thing, and people are then citing research, we need to take a step back and look at that journal. Is this a legitimate journal? Has it been indexed? Does it have a decent impact factor? Are there typos in that journal? Is the journal only publishing the same thing over and over again in terms of an echo chamber? And then when we get past that, if the journal has passed our level of detection, the next phase is what kind of study is it? Is it a case report or is it a systematic review meta-analysis of a bunch of well-done randomized controlled trials? What is being reported? Is the relative risk, that percentage of change being reported, or is it the absolute risk? Does the conclusion support the primary outcome? Because if not, we probably did some of that p-hacking. And then what is the conflict of interest? I think it's really important to look at that. Do you have any other last minute thoughts to give people in terms of these are the red flags and keep an eye out for these things?
I think the big picture take home, I would say, is that good science is slow and meticulous and humble, right? And pseudoscience is fast and viral and large claims about big impact type things. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I would give.
Awesome. Josh, thank you so much for joining me for both of these podcasts. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. It is so good to see you because we email back and forth in text. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me. And to everyone who listened, thank you for coming on this journey. And as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. All of these blogs and podcasts and all of the content is coming from interactions with my patients and different questions that you guys are sending me. So I always love to hear what is on your minds. And until then, I will talk to you next week. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's No Filter Doctor. If you enjoyed the content, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also go to www.thewholehumanhealthandwellbeing.com and sign up for the weekly newsletter where you will get a link to the blog, that week's podcast, and a health tip of the week sent directly to you. It's important to know that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it's not intended as medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The information discussed should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should it replace individualized medical care. If you have questions or concerns about your health, please contact your own healthcare provider. Any decisions to delay or forego a medical evaluation or treatment based on the information discussed in this podcast are made so at your own risk. My only financial disclosure is my medical practice, the whole human health and well-being. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.